In this video, we are going to have a look at how to protect token theft in Entra ID. So according to Microsoft, token theft attacks has been on the rise and they have recorded around 147,000 token theft attempts in the last 1 year alone. So this is something that we have to look out for. So in simple terms, token theft is all about stealing the token that you have on your machine by a bad actor and using the token to log into your Microsoft 365 endpoint and accessing your data and compromising the security of your organization. So let's have a look at what exactly happens when we log in and how a token theft happens and how we can prevent it. So if you're new to the channel, my name is Rajit and I work as a Microsoft Cloud Architect in the UK. I've been running my own consultancy company for the last 14 years, working for smaller and larger clients. And hence, feel free to get in touch if you have any consultancy opportunities. I do publish videos around Entra ID, Intune, and the wider Microsoft 365 stack, which kind of tackles real world problems, and also videos that cover Microsoft certification parts. So, if those topics are of any interest to you, please do consider subscribing to the channel, as it will help the YouTube gods to push the video to a wider audience with similar interest. If you do have any questions about the topic, feel free to add them in the comment section and I'll try my best to answer them as soon as possible. And subscribing to the channel also signals me that there is an audience for the topics that are being covered, and it kind of helps me to go with new videos every day. So let's get started. So what exactly happens when we try and log into Entra ID? Let's assume that you are logging into your mailbox and you're prompted for your username and password. So you enter those credentials and you are challenged for an MFA. And once you satisfy MFA, you are being authenticated against Entra ID. So as the IDP platform, Entra ID issues a token, and that token is stored on the machine that you're using. And this particular token that we have helps us having a smoother session with the Entra workloads that we have. So we don't have to re-authenticate every time we try and access an endpoint. And these tokens have an expiry date, and these tokens can be refreshed. So that's a whole other topic on its own. So the issue that we are trying to tackle in this video is how a bad actor can get hold of your token that is stored on the machine and how it can be misused. So now that we understand the concept of token and how it gets stored on the local machine that you're using, a bad actor can get hold of these tokens mainly by using malicious links. So you might have a malicious link that comes in your email and the user clicks on that, which downloads a malicious software onto the machine, which is capable of extracting the session token and sending it to the bad actor. And once the bad actor has a session token, they can use it and get access to the Microsoft 365 workloads that you have access to. So they could download all the files that you have in OneDrive, they could send emails on your behalf, or they can be silent and try and have some kind of lateral movements or get the idea around the organization and start planning the attacks, anything of that sort. So the first step in preventing token theft or any kind of attack will be the user education. So you have to educate your user base about the importance of not clicking on malicious links, figuring out which one is a phishing email or any suspicious emails, getting the culture of reporting those kind of emails to the IT team. So we have seen what happens when we log in with the session tokens and how a token theft can happen. And let's have a look at how to prevent it. Now, Microsoft doesn't have a single solution to block token theft. What they have come out with to start with is a conditional access policy, which enforces the tokens to be bound to the devices. Now, the problem that we have here is the fact that the session tokens can be used on a different machine without any further checks. So, what Microsoft has come up with is the idea of having the tokens bound to a device. So, you're cryptographically signing the token with your session key so that it can only be used on that particular device. And using a conditional access policy, you're enforcing that you want to have device bound tokens when you try and use a particular workload, say, for example, Exchange Online. So let's have a look at the first way by which we can minimize the impact of token theft. So the first one is the conditional access policy. So for that, let's go into policies within our Entra ID portal. So let's click on protection on the left-hand side, expand it, and click on conditional access. And if you click on policies within the middle pane, it gives you a list of all the policies that you currently have. So I have a few that's been listed over here, which has been covered in a previous video, which details the top 10 conditional access policies that you should have in your organization to secure your Microsoft 365 tenant. So if you haven't watched that, please do go and watch. That is a very good session in which it goes through some of the not so common conditional access policies that you need to have in your organization, for example, for blocking device code flows. So I'll put a link in the description and also somewhere up in the screen so that you can have a look. Now let's tackle the policy that we are trying to create over here for blocking token theft. So let's click on new policy and let's give a name. Let's say token protection, token theft protection, token, if I can spell, theft protection. Now let's click on a select number of users to start with. Always select with a smaller group. That is the recommendation. So let's just select with a couple of users that we have. And once you are happy with the way the conditional access policy behaves, you can open it to a wider workload. So let's pick a couple of users in my tenant. Let's click select and target. We are selecting selected apps. Now, the conditional access policy that Microsoft has come up with only works against Exchange Online and SharePoint Online at the moment. So basically, the clients that can be protected by using bound session tokens are Outlook, Teams, and SharePoint. So let's just select Exchange Online and SharePoint Online from the list. So let's type in Office 365. Do not select the entire Office 365 application set that we have, the first one up here. Let's specifically click on Exchange Online and SharePoint Online. Now click on Select. Now let's go into the conditions. Now over here, we have to pick the device. Now this conditional access policy will only successfully work on Windows machines at the moment. So let's click on the device platform and click on Windows. So this means that this conditional access policy doesn't protect other workload platforms like Android devices or iOS or Mac for that instance. So only Windows devices, Windows 10 and later, the latest versions, will be protected. So let's click on Done. And now let's click on Client Applications. Now another point to note with this policy is that it only works on desktop clients. So no browser. And let's uncheck the legacy clients that we have. So only desktop clients will be protected by using this conditional access policy. And configuring this policy with any of the wrong information will block users from accessing the workload. So let's be specific, be clear regarding what you're following here and just exactly mimic the conditional access policy settings. So let's click on Done. Now let's click on Grant Control. So we want to grant access to Exchange Online and SharePoint Online, provided that the conditions that we have specified are met. We can say we want to have multi-factor authentication, and the policy that we are looking for is in session. So let's select MFA, for example, and let's just click on session. And this is what we are looking for: require token protection for sign-in sessions. It is still in preview and it only works on desktop clients, so Outlook, Teams, and SharePoint, and it has to be a Windows 10 or later machine, Entra registered, joined, or hybrid joined. Now, when you think of Exchange Online, other ways of authentication like using the Exchange Online PowerShell module doesn't work. So if you bring in those ones into the scope, it wouldn't work. So it is not yet configured to work with device-bound tokens. Now let's click on Select, and let's click on Report Only Mode to start with, and let's click on Create. So this is the policy that we need to create to start with in order to have a stab at the token theft protection. Now, once we have it in report only mode and open to a select set of users, we have to monitor the conditional access policy that we have by using the sign-in logs and seeing the impact of turning on this particular conditional access policy. Now, this particular token theft protection is an Entra ID P2 feature. So if you don't have the Entra ID Plan 2 or the Premium 2 plan, you won't get the option within the conditional access policy. So when you click on the conditional access policy and go into session, this particular option that says require token protection for sign-in sessions, it won't be in the list over here. So you need Entra ID P2 for this to work. And even with the P2 plan, we are only protecting Windows 10, the latest versions, and Windows 11, the latest version machines, and just tackling Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and using the FAT clients on the machines and the device to be Entra registered, joined, or hybrid Entra joined. So there's a lot of conditions, and we are only tackling a very small percentage of sign-ins by using this conditional access policy. So it is something to start with. What Microsoft has said is that they will expand the platforms that it supports and the applications that it supports as we go along. Now, regarding the Microsoft applications, it is pretty clear that they will be updating it in the coming months so that sign-ins to those applications will be forcing device-bound tokens. But for third-party applications that we currently have, that we are currently federated with, those applications has to be updated by the vendors so that we can have a forced device-bound tokens. Now, that is going to take some time. So even though with Plan 2, Entra ID, and with the conditional access policies, we are not kind of covering the entire problem. So this is one step by which we can mitigate the risk that we have. Now let's look at other ways. So let's just close this off. Let's close conditional access policies. Now, the next set of steps that we can use along with this conditional access policy that we have configured for token theft protection is the usual ones that we should have in any organization. So these are things like enforcing managed devices for connectivity to Entra endpoints or cloud endpoints, and again enforcing compliant devices and MFA, and also going beyond and saying that we are only enforcing authenticated connections coming from specific IP addresses or from specific countries. Now, to kind of expand this, what we are saying with this conditional access policy that we are about to create is that we want the machines to be fully managed from which the connections to our cloud endpoints are coming. We want those machines to be compliant. We want to have MFA for those sessions. And we want those connections coming only from a set of specific IP addresses, which are our office IPs, or a set of countries in which our organization operates. For example, if you have an organization in the UK and you have an office in London, and that's about it, you can limit the connections coming into Entra ID and any other Microsoft Cloud endpoints to be coming from UK and from the specific IPs, that is your public IP address that you have for that particular office. If you don't want your users to work outside the office, you can just specify the public IP and enforce the connection to be coming from inside or behind that public IP address, which is your corporate office. If you want your users to work from home as well, you can have United Kingdom as a country, so that kind of covers most of the IP addresses in the UK, so those connections will be allowed. Second step that we can take in tackling token theft in Entra ID is to have a conditional access policy, which is kind of common in most of the organizations. So here we are saying that our devices has to be managed by an MDM solution, preferably in Tune, and that the device has to be compliant, and we need to have MFA satisfied before we are allowing any connections into the cloud endpoints. So let's click on new policy to create that particular policy, and let's just give it a name, say CAP 11, token theft prevention restrictions, for example. And let's click on all users, and it's always good to exclude at least one user account, preferably with admin rights so that we are not locking out the entire tenant. And let's click on that. And target resources, we are selecting all the cloud applications. And within conditions, we are going into device platforms. And here we can configure the device platforms that are used in your organization. So for example, if your user base is predominantly Windows power users, you can select Windows. If you don't have Mac and Linux, then you can exclude those. So we are just reducing the attack surface. And Android and iOS, most of the companies have that. So let's select these three. And locations, we don't really mind. Or you can configure locations based on specific IPs and the countries in which the company operates. Now, client applications, we can configure and say we don't want legacy clients to be targeting. Browser and mobile apps and desktop clients are fine. And what we want is the grant option. So we want to grant access in this particular scenario, but we want to have multi-factor authentication as a default. And we also want to have this option selected, required device to be marked as compliant. So when you check this box, and if you come down and say that you want to have all the selected controls are required for granting access, what it means is that we want to have a machine that is managed by your MDM solutions, let's say Intune, and that device that you are managing has to be compliant. And you have to have MFA satisfied before we are granting access to the Microsoft endpoints using this conditional access policy. So even if you have a token theft that happens in your machine and the token is getting used in a different machine, that device won't be managed by Intune, it won't be compliant, and hence you won't and hence the bad actor won't be able to gain access to your tenant even if they have the token. So let's click on select, and let's proceed with the current selections. Make sure that it is in report only mode and click on create. So this is the second conditional access policy. So the first one is the one with the Entra ID Plan 2 requirement, which is only covering Exchange Online and SharePoint Online, which will be covering the other applications in due course, but at the moment, it is not really worth having Entra ID Plan 2 just for that. So if your organization doesn't have Plan 2, you don't have to purchase it just for the sake of it. You can use the second conditional access policy that we just discussed, which kind of limits the connectivity to the cloud endpoints from a managed compliant device satisfying MFA, and you can always, on top of that, add country-wide restrictions or IP address-based restrictions. So that is a good enough solution just there. Now, if you have Intune and if your machines are managed using Intune, you can always push in an Intune policy or even GPO for that matter, in which you want to enable credential guard and configure the local security authority, so the LSA process, to be a protected one. So that kind of again makes it harder for any kind of malicious software to extract the session tokens that you have on the machine. So let's jump into the Intune portal and see how we can configure that. So let's go into Endpoint Manager over here. So let's click on intune.microsoft.com and we go into Devices and we select Windows from the device list by the platform. So we click on Devices and we want to make a configuration. So let's click on creating a configuration profile. So there are a few ones that are listed which are already covered in my video series in the channel. So if these ones are of any interest to you, please do check out those videos. So let's click on create and say new policy. And let's select Windows 10 and later as the platform. And let's say sessions catalog is good enough and click on create. Now let's give in a name. Let's say token theft prevention restrictions. Let's take off the cap or give any sensible name that makes things much more easier for you in due course. And let's click on next. Let's click on add settings and let's search for credential guard. So let's wait for the settings picker to come back. So okay, fine, there's a typo in there. Credential guard. So you have device guard and you can select credential guard over here. So now we need to turn on credential guard with UEFI lock. So that's one setting. So let's close the settings picker and let's click on add settings again. And let's go for local security authority. So the LSA process, local authority, security authority. And let's search for that. Now one comes up and let's configure LSA protected process. Let's select it on the right hand side. Let's close the settings picker. And here we have to enable it. So LSA will run as a protected process and this configuration is UEFI locked. So it doesn't allow any other malicious software to trigger LSA processes. So that's running under a protective mode or as a protected process. So these two options will further boost your organization in defending against token theft. So this is where when you have your devices being fully managed by Intune, you can push the policy into those devices when which we are kind of configuring the LSA protected process and credential guard, which makes it slightly difficult for the session tokens to be extracted by using malicious software. You can use the same settings in GPO if you have machines being on-premise joined, and that gives you an additional line of defense against token theft. So let's click on next. Now scope tags are optional, so let's click on next again. Now over here in assignments, I can select add all devices and maybe further use a different filter if you have filters predefined. So I could say include filter devices in assignment and I can pick this one, Entra ID joined machines. So this means that I'm targeting the policies which are Entra ID joined and which are kind of in the scope of Intune. Or you can have a group. You can add a group. Let's say okay to that. Let's click on, let's remove that. And let's add a group, and you can add a group in which you have your machines pre-selected. So maybe a small set of POC user machines that you have, proof of concept, one which you can test the policies that you're deploying. And if everything checks out, you can just come back to the policy and then open it to the wider user base by saying add all devices. So either one is fine. So let's click on add devices for the time being because I only have a couple of machines in this test tenant. And let's click on next. And here we get a summary of what we have done so far. So we are setting two policies. One is credential guard over here, and the other one is configuring the LSA processes as protected. And once you click on create, it gets assigned to all the machines that we have in Intune. So that is the third layer of defense that we have against identity theft. So to summarize, we can have three types of policies. So two conditional access policies. So the first one being the one in which we need to require token protection for sign-in sessions, which is an Entra ID Plan 2. But again, it has its own limitations in the sense that you can only have device-bound tokens while connecting to Exchange Online and SharePoint Online. So that drastically minimizes the protection surface that we have. So in order to work around that, we need a second conditional access policy in which we are enforcing that the devices from which the connections are coming to our Microsoft endpoints has to be fully managed by Intune, it has to be compliant, and we need to have MFA satisfied. And on top of that, you can even go with country-wide restrictions or IP-based restrictions. Now, the third one is by using the Intune portal and configuring a device configuration policy in which we are enforcing credential guard and also running LSA as a protected process. So hope this video has been informative. If you found it useful, please do consider subscribing to the channel and also sharing it with your colleagues who may have similar interest. Thank you.